It's because of our clients' concerns that we wanted to organize this panel today to discuss how American businesses can remain competitive in the current national and international landscape. The United States is the greatest country in the world. We at Jones Day believe that American businesses, corporate America, are one of the 4 pillars that make it great. Yet for some time now, corporate America has been under attack from various elements in this nation. And this attack has resulted in policies that are antagonistic to business growth, which ironically, of course, harms each and every one of us, including those elements that are attacking it. Why would a nation seek to weaken one of its greatest strengths? Well, some of this, I believe, can be traced back to a lack of thoughtful, balanced public discourse on various issues like the ones we're going to talk about today. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to our terrific moderator, Jerry Seib, Washington Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal, to introduce the panelists and start off the conversation.
Thank you. It's a really pleasure to be here. I want to thank Jones Day for A, having a fabulous view, and B, and more importantly, for actually providing something I think is actually incredibly and woefully short supply this week, which is actual substantive conversation. I mean, I think Chairman Brady, you don't need an introduction. I think you, more than most people here, actually have the ability to push the issues that we're going to talk about. And from the perch you have in the Ways and Means Committee, there's no more important place in Washington to address the issues that we're going to talk about now. So, Chairman Brady, I invite you to start this conversation, and we'll be happy to follow you up. Thank you very much.
Well, Jerry, thank you very much for allowing me to kick off this day. You couldn't have a better title about American competitiveness on tax and trade. And we're here today, I'm here today, this week in Cleveland, because presidential races shouldn't just be a contest of personalities. It ought to be a contest of ideas. Look, this was a tough financial crisis, but this has been the slowest economic recovery in 50 years. We are missing about 6 million jobs, should be back. The economy by now. We are missing a big part of our GDP. Imagine the economy of Canada. Imagine that economy. That's missing from the U.S. economy today. Should be back at this point in the recovery. An average family of 4 is missing about $1,000 a month from their paycheck. Ought to be back by now. And so we ought to be having this presidential race discussion about how we jumpstart this economy, how we reject sort of the new normal of 2% growth and stagnant wages, and where we go from here. Tax reform and trade is a key element to that. Recently, House Republicans unveiled our tax reform blueprint. It is a blueprint built for growth. We want a tax code built for the growth of wages, built for the growth of U.S. jobs, built for the growth of the U.S. economy. And as we do that, our goal was to leapfrog America from dead last among our global competitors into that lead pack of most pro-growth tax codes on the planet and keep us there for the longer term. I know in the presidential election, free trade isn't a very popular issue, but it ought to be. The term free trade, sort of like free speech, doesn't refer to the cost. It refers to the economic freedom to trade. It's at the heart of our free enterprise system. America is incredibly good at this, and what I love about this is the freedom to buy and sell and compete anywhere in the world with as little government interference as possible. It also answers the question of who has the power. Who has the power to decide what products you can buy and at what price? Who has the power to decide when you come up with that new product, that breakthrough service, that breakthrough technology that can disrupt the whole industry? Who has the power to decide if you can sell it? Free trade, the answer there is you, the consumer, has that power. And here we are living at a time where people are very strongly Tea Party and against the government. The freedom to trade, Jerry, may be the most anti-establishment freedom we have. It essentially tells politicians and special interests to take a hike. We'll buy the product that we can best afford. We'll deliver and discover the service that we believe is right for consumers. It basically sets aside Washington's special interests, moves that power down to consumers. We ought to be not doing less of that. We ought to be doing more of it. And so it's The reason we're here this week is to talk about tax reform, talk about trade, talk about competitiveness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I would, first of all, that's a fabulous setup for what we will discuss here. I would just note that as a Washingtonian, John Harwood, a friend and colleague of mine, wrote a book with me a few years ago about why Washington doesn't work very well. We devoted one chapter, though, to the Ways and Means Committee because we said this is the one place where there's still some bipartisan conversation going on in the city. And you know, these subjects we're talking about now actually do lend themselves to some bipartisanship, which sets up the conversation we can have here now. I mean, the topic, as you all know, is American competitiveness, trade, and tax policy. My job is made easy by the fact that we have a fabulous panel to my right here to discuss this. Mario Longhi, President and CEO of United States Steel Corporation, not just the CEO, but also a guy who's transforming that company, which I hope he can describe a little bit as well. Mark Weinberger, Chairman and Global Chairman and CEO of EY, and somebody who's lived in both these worlds because you were Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy in the George W. Bush administration, which is one of those jobs that people outside Washington understand how incredibly important it is. Thanks for being here, Mark. And Ray Wiacek, who's the partner in Jones Day's Washington office and a guy who often testifies before congressional committees and kind of helps create the connection between the real world and the politics and policy world. So thank you all for being here. Mario, let me start with you, and let me start with trade, because trade is the one substantive issue that's actually being seriously discussed here, not this week, but also in the campaign in general. And you know, the issue on the table, which the chairman addressed a little bit, was free trade. And the conversation in the Republican Party is free trade good or a good thing or a bad thing? Are free trade agreements a good thing or a bad thing? Let me ask you from the perspective of your position running a large multinational company. Do free trade agreements help or hurt the economy, help or hurt your company?
Well, first of all, thank you to Jones Day for having us here together. I'm honored to be here, my colleagues, to talk about something that I believe is really important. If you look at the history of how humanity evolved and societies evolved, some elements were always present. I mean, you look at the dimension of knowledge sharing, you look at the dimension of mobility, migration, and commerce and trade was always a key part of it. So I don't think societies can evolve without trade. The issue is when you get to current day, in the globalized environment where change is happening so fast, one dimension, additional dimension is missing, which is the rule of law. The freedom, as Chairman Brady said, to do trade is an important feature, but it has to be done under the rule of law. If it's not that, then you can never really have a fair and level playing field by which the true market forces can be applied and success can occur to the people that do it best. And the outcome of that will serve society the best way. So that is a thing that I believe as we, as more advanced nations, engage with developing nations, that was overlooked for too long a period of time. And I think that is the most important feature that needs to be fixed for us to be able to truly enjoy the opportunity to compete fairly and to deliver for society the best outcomes under the rule of law.
Let me just follow up real quickly on that. Rule of law, in your reading of this situation and in the international trade context, means what exactly?
Well, let me give you a simple example. When we compete out in the world, we are in many cases competing not against companies, but against countries. You take some countries that provide to their companies 40 different types of subsidies. They don't have to deal with any of the legal obligations of any organization that exists here in America. And in the absence of that, you go on years being hurt until some kind of action is taken and then the level playing field is reestablished. Every time that we were able to reestablish the level playing field, our companies have won. And won fairly and squarely based on developing new products, services, creating new jobs that are the best middle class jobs you can find. And I think that is the portion that is missing.
Mark, so Mario's talking here about competitiveness. Let's tie competitiveness to tax policy. I mean, I think there's a consensus that American tax policy as currently structured doesn't help, probably hurts American competitiveness in some ways. From your perspective, again, running a multinational company that lives in this world every day, how does that cut? Where does American tax policy hurt American competitiveness specifically?
So, Jerry, great question. Thank you. And my hat's off to Jones Day for having this great event as well. And I'm really thrilled to be here. We have a great partnership for many years. You know, trade and tax, before I get to tax specifically, are two things that you just can't ignore. They're like waves crashing down upon us that are going to be part of our competitiveness, that as much as politicians want to say we shouldn't do them, it's inevitable. You know, the Chairman Brady talked about it. 95% of all consumers in the world live outside the United States. 90% of everyone under the age of 30 lives in an emerging market. Everyone alive today, of all the people alive, 90% of those under 30 live in an emerging market. 80% of the world's demand is outside the United States. It is not like it used to be when our systems were created many, many years ago. So from a trade perspective, frankly, if we don't get into those markets, we lose. But that's crazy for us to be talking about building walls, either metaphorical or not. When you come to trade, it's the same thing. We designed a tax system basically in the 1960s, where the international tax rules were first developed. 1986 was our next and last major tax reform act before the internet was around, before we had really mobility of people, mobility of intellectual property all around the world. The systems have not kept up. In 1986, we lowered our tax rate to 36%, which was at that time a tax haven around the world. Since then, 90% of the OECD countries have lowered it. We now have the highest effective tax rate in the free world, and the only one that has a worldwide taxing system. So it's not only our high rate, but it's our base of taxing companies on their global earnings. In the old days, we could have competed against that. Today, we can't. Inversions, you hear a lot about it. That's the small part of the problem. Inversions, no CEO wakes up in the morning and says, I want to leave the United States. I can't wait to go tell my employees and the United States government I want to invert. They are doing it because they have to, because the investments will go to the highest after-tax returns possible anywhere in the world. The bigger issue is foreign acquisitions of U.S. companies. We've seen some 1,300 or more over the last 10 years because it's much more effective for the parent to be held overseas to get a more effective global competitive tax rate. Unsustainable. Democrats and Republicans now do see that they need to do something here. Chairman Brady has done a terrific job of laying out a blueprint that I think will be a discussion point. The hard part is, no matter how much we want to do trade, no matter how much we want to do tax, people look at the CEOs like us and the big lawyers and big government, and they don't trust us. And so we can't get these major reforms through until we start to build that trust that enables us to be, which is the third tree. I think you got trade, you got tax, you got trust. Until we do that, we're not going to be able to get anything through the system. What we saw is, as you said, Jerry, even though Democrats and Republicans want to lower the overall rate, want to deal with some of this international $2+ trillion stuck overseas, we can't get Democrats and Republicans to talk together and trust each other enough to put something through the system. We're going to have to work on that.
You know, it's an interesting point because I was having a conversation with the British ambassador in Washington a couple of days before the Brexit vote, and he said the big problem they had was they marshaled really great arguments for Remain, and it didn't matter how powerful the arguments were because nobody believed them because they were coming from the government. Absolutely. That, by definition, made them unbelievable to a lot of voters right now, and I think that's the kind of attitude we're all coping with here in this country a little bit. Ray, let me turn to you to bore down a little bit more on the tax policy. I mean, it is striking right now, and for the last couple of years, that there really is a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the code doesn't work as it is now. The question is, what fixes are possible? From your point of view, as somebody who lives this every day, what would be a smart fix that's also a doable fix in the short term right now? How do you see the possibilities?
One of the things that has hurt us is not only the gridlock and partisanship, but the need or desire to pass the grand bargain, if you will. And to decide all issues. Do we need a millionaire's tax? Do we need tax relief for mainstream small businesses in the cities of America? Do we need death tax reform and so on? And I live in the corporate world, and if the topic is competitiveness, I think the corporate system and the corporate income tax system is the most broken. Mm-hmm. And Mark says we have the highest tax rate in the industrialized world. You need to know exactly what that is. We tax at a 35% rate. The Brits tax at a 20% rate. Earlier this spring, they announced that they were going to 17%, and if you ever wonder whether Competition is now being waged on the tax battlefield. When they announced they were going to 17%, they leaned into the mic and they said, which is less than half of the U.S. rate. And now in reaction to Brexit, they announced they're going to reduce the rate to less than 15%. And I'm not talking about the Cayman Islands or Bermuda. I'm talking about the cousins. This is Britain. I'm talking about real countries. Canada taxes at 12%. Ireland taxes at 12.5%. And we tax on a worldwide basis, as Mark mentioned. The United States not only taxes its companies on what they make in America, it taxes them on what they make in Germany or what they make in China or what they make in Japan. The rest of the world taxes only domestic income. The French call their companies champions. They actually want French companies to go out in the world with the French flag and compete against us. And Mario put it well. He said, we not only compete against the other multinationals in the rest of the world, we compete against their countries. And he talked about 40-some subsidies that he faces against that are benefiting his competitors. One of those subsidies, in effect, is tax. These really, really, really low rates are meant to be competitive. When George Osborne, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced the rate of less than 15%, everybody said it was Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. It was occasioned by Brexit, but again, he leaned into the mic and when asked why do we want to do this, and he said, we want to have a super competitive economy. So what do? We try to fix everything, but I would hope at some point, if we can't, that instead of waiting for the grand bargain and waiting for the grand bargain, we just turn to corporate tax reform and get it done. And that's easy for me to say because I think it's substantively correct based on kind of the worldwide taxation and based on the rates. But wow, is that politically difficult. When we turn over the chairman that he's going to tell the people in his district or the people of America that I'm giving a tax cut to the big corporations of America and I'm going to do something for you later, that's just so hard.
Having been in these battles both in the Bush and Clinton administrations as well as the last year with the chairman, I think you're spot on, right? It's inconceivable to me that we will get a corporate rate reduction for big fat corporate CEOs and corporations without dealing with the S-corps and pass-throughs. And the 25% rate in the chairman's plan on business income is a great, I think, compromise that would help to get there. Whether you continue to go through all the individual provisions or not is another story. But I can just tell you the coalition comes apart pretty quickly if we don't have business tax reform beyond just corporate tax reform.
Imagine a moment where the tax rates are truly competitive for us. And imagine a moment where that can lead for us to boost back the participation of manufacturing into our economy. Mm-hmm. Today, manufacturing contributes to about 10–11% of our GDP. If you look at Germany, China, Korea, they are up in the 25s and 30%. Mm. And there is an important fact that is missed when it comes to manufacturing. Of every invention, 70% of the full value of any great idea is captured when you make it. Because making it generates the opportunity for much more innovation and for acceleration of innovation. If you're not making it, it doesn't happen. How do you think China came from being a $1 trillion country to 10 trillion over the period of the last 10 or 15 years? It was massive making of everything.
There are a lot of topics on the table. One, I think Mark mentioned inversions. Ray, I was going to ask you to follow up on that a little bit. Some of the administration has tried to do some things to at least slow down, if not stop, inversions. Do those work? Will they work? Or are they making the problem worse?
So inversions are many things. They're obviously unpopular, and we really don't want to lose our companies. That's why we're here trying to talk about competitiveness. And they're unpopular to the point where the Secretary of the Treasury said they're unpatriotic, but they're actually also understandable and rational reaction to the system we just outlined. So then you turn to what's the right thing to do in response to that, because we'd like to keep our companies here. And that's actually been the big divide between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans have said what we need to do in response to that is fix the system that's causing our companies to leave. We need to have a competitive rate. We need to embrace territoriality. We need to figure out what we're going to do for income offsets and so on, because it's a difficult question. And the Democrats have said we have to put up a wall to keep our companies in. It's another metaphorical wall, but it's a wall. And that won't work. Money flows, rational decisions kind of prevail, and it won't happen.
on inversions, in a globalized economy, and that's obviously where we are and increasingly are, is there a potential for a kind of a race to the bottom? In other words, is there a place where this all evens out, or is that not really reachable? Is it, or inversions essentially a fact of life that we should accept and not worry about so much?
Well, that's a fundamental question, Jerry, and I would say that, to Ray's point, you cannot stop inversions in any other way without having a competitive tax system for the long term. That's what will stop it. That's why, you mentioned Ireland, you got Singapore, you got, even China's got a lower rate, you got most of the ASEAN countries, you got India, which is now trying to reduce its corporate rate and its budget. I mean, everyone is doing it. 90% of the OECD countries reduce their rates. It's an average 25% rate. We will not be able to have, either they'll be inverting or they'll be failing, is the bottom line. I mean, today, it's interesting, of the global Fortune 500 companies, 10 years ago, there were 47 headquartered in emerging markets. Today, there's 157. So just over 10 years, you're seeing companies we never heard of become the largest companies in the world. Now, part of that is because of demand and consumers and increases in technology and advancement of the third world, but part of it is because we become less competitive.
One of the factors that people discuss in the competitiveness realm, Mario, and your company lives with this a lot, is regulation. Regulation is a fact of life. Death tax is regulation. There's smart regulation. There's probably less smart regulation. Where's the American system now on that spectrum of smart regulation versus dumb regulation, for lack of a better term?
For existing businesses that need to continuously evolve and innovate, if I have a great idea today to change part of a process that requires the introduction of a new element, it will take me 3 to 4 years to approve. If I just want to repair whatever it is that I'm going to repair, to keep it as is, I can do it tomorrow. That's how bad it is. And we have the government intruding in federal governments intruding in degrees of environmental safety and so forth that it consumes the life of operators today. Instead of innovating, creating value for society and everybody else, they are there just battling conceptual things that have absolutely nothing to do with safety or the true improvement in environment. It's just flat out control.
And Mark, you see a similar phenomenon in financial services now. I mean, it's a growth industry for you guys to a certain extent, but what's it doing to the financial services sector, the American financial services sector?
Well, the American financial service sector is under tremendous stress and change, of course. Because it's a safe haven relative to the rest of the world, it's doing great. But the fintechs are coming around. They make no mistake. The World Economic Forum told us that by 2020, we're going to lose over 5 million jobs due to technology and advancement. There'll be 2 million created, so it's going to change. The problem is, you said it earlier, Mario, the dramatic speed of globalization today and the dramatic speed of the disruption that's going on in businesses, in industries, cross sectors, is causing a dislocated population. It's leaving people behind who are the people who are not getting the wage increases along with the monetary policy that created the financial asset increases and are not being able to get ahead in this environment. And that is going to accelerate. And we can't ignore it because we do it at our own peril. If we haven't learned that we have to do more for that class of people, then we're going to find ourselves in a very poor situation.
Jerry, if I may add a little bit of statistics, if you look at both topics and if you look at the negative impact it has had, 90% of the patents created in the United States come from manufacturing. 70% of the private investment in R&D comes from the private sector. And that's diminishing because the private sector in manufacturing is getting smaller. Over the past little over a decade, 63,000 plants have disappeared in the United States. Just think about that. And I go back to that point. If we can bring manufacturing back to about a 20% of GDP, we will be picking up on all these things. It can't happen if we're going to have to keep dealing with these kinds of regulation and taxation.
Ask one last question that I'm interested in, because it was briefly a topic of a lot of debate in Washington. Does Ex-Im Bank matter? And is it, if the temporary demise of the Ex-Im Bank is a sign that there's an actual bipartisan attack on what people like to call crony capitalism, can that get way out of hand. Yeah.
So I think it's an excellent question because I think it encapsulates the whole discussion that we've been having, because there's a lot of partisanship around it. There's a theoretically correct answer, but then there's a practical answer. The partisanship around the EXIM Bank is, do you believe in big government or small government? Do you believe in a system that should be small? Should the government actually be subsidizing corporations? And in the abstract, maybe the EXIM Bank is a bad idea, but we don't live in the abstract. Every other country, or major trading partner, I shouldn't say every other, has their version of the EXIM. When we decide domestically, what are we going to do about pass-throughs? What are we going to do about a millionaire's tax? What are we going to do about the death tax? Those are domestic issues. How, if, and when we address them is within our control. International issues are not in our control. Yeah. It could be entirely true that the EXIM Bank is not a good idea. It doesn't matter. The rest of the guys are doing it. Yeah. And the whole idea that the 35% rate might be the right rate, and the other countries might be competing unfairly and wrongfully in a race to the bottom, as you say. It doesn't matter. The rest of the world is doing it. Inherent in the world international are a bunch of other countries, and they don't really care what we think or what we're doing. They like to do things contrary to us.
It's very annoying, let's face it. Yeah. It really is. But Mark, I think as a final note here, I think you'll agree with me that it's an odd world in which the Chamber of Commerce is running to the Democratic Party to save the EXIM Bank, but that's where we've landed.
A strange bedfellows, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.